we are. Hello, everyone. Yeah. I'll do that too. So we don't, I've never quite done anything quite like this before. We are to have a conversation, and we don't have any kind of roadmap, and neither one of us brought notes, which is exceptional for both of us.
Yes.
But we did agree before we started on where we would begin. So we wanted to just maybe probe at a definition of wisdom, which I think will be a beginning definition of wisdom. But how would you do that, Elizabeth? Where would you start?
Well, I was looking at the Rubin before we met, just looking at some of the statues, the iconography, and there's this one posture that you see in a lot of the Buddhas and the Hindu statues of, one hand like this and one hand like this. And I've made this a spiritual practice of mine for years, where if I'm feeling unbalanced, scared, lacking in wisdom, I've got it down. I've practiced it so much that I can just sort of like, if I'm at a meeting or something, just kind of hide my hands under the table. Because you know how practice in the body is very powerful. So, you could even try this right now, like one hand out, and it's this sense of like, I have boundaries. I know my values. This is part of my wisdom. I know what to do. I know when to say no. And then the other hand is like that Buddhist term of unconditional friendliness toward everything. I am open. So it's this sense of no and yes. And if I've ever needed this practice, it's been now. Because the downstairs brain, the instinctual brain, in my reaction to the election was so wanting to go out and do something, just something, anything, and then this sort of reminder to take it all in and to wait and to hold it and to digest it, to metabolize what's happening before this. So to me, this is wisdom. It's knowing when to do what, to be either really active or receptive, and to hold them both simultaneously.
That's really interesting. So I wrote this book about wisdom without defining it, and then after the book was out, people they wanted to start and have a quick, give me your elevator speech. What wisdom is, and I had written several hundred pages about it without defining it.
I'm so happy to hear that. Great relief.
So what I came to after a few of those interviews is as much kind of getting at what it's not as what it is, and how it manifests itself as opposed to what it is. I think wisdom is not, it's distinct from, I think it is absolutely connected to something like intelligence and something like knowledge. I think unlike something like intelligence or something like knowledge, which can be possessions, you can point at a person and say that is an intelligent person, that is a knowledgeable person, that is a piece of knowledge. I think the measure of wisdom, the litmus test of wisdom, is the imprint a life has on lives around it. I think that's how we know wisdom when we see it. I also think that it's about, again, it takes something like knowledge or something like information, and it is that extra step of discernment.
Yeah. I love that word, discernment.
I love that word too. And that is a practice and kind of a pause that we really need right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a muscle we need to build up.
Yeah. In your interviews with so many wise people, I would imagine you'd say many of them are wise. Like, do you find that if someone is older, that necessarily makes them wiser? Or does it have anything ever to do with gender or experience?
Yeah, that phrase, old and wise, I realize is kind of a stumbling block for people. There is absolutely something so precious about a life that has been long and wisdom that has been accumulated across the passage of time and across many chapters of life. But I think wisdom is accessible to all of us at any moment in life. And even if you think about stages of life, yes, there's something that an 80-year-old can have that the rest of us can't, that you have to earn. But there's a wisdom that young children have, that any parent has seen. Einstein said that he started asking the most important questions that he followed the rest of his life when he was 4. Mm-hmm. And children are little theologians, they're little philosophers. They are asking the big questions of life. They cut straight through to the heart of the matter. There's a wisdom that we have in young adulthood. There's this sense of urgency. There's this ability to see the world whole and to be ready to throw your life at that. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it is restricted to one stage or another. And the other thing that I really started to discern as I wrote that book, and I was sifting through all these conversations about what are the qualities of lives of people who have become wise, is that it really emerges through the raw materials of our life. And we all have those. And it's what we do with them moment to moment, day to day, year to year. Mm-hmm. How do you see that? Do you think about wisdom? How do you think about how have you experienced how people acquire it? Mm.
Well, a tendency as we age is to become kind of cranky and unwise. And I'm really fighting against that in myself.
Oh, well, yeah. So that's another thing. You don't necessarily grow old and wise. Some people just get old.
Yeah. Yes. And I've really felt that since the election. I mean, I don't mean to make an assumption that everyone in here was traumatized by the election, but what were you all? Yes. Okay.
Okay, but how do you know if there's somebody who didn't say yes?
No, I really have really been working hard not to make assumptions. I think it's really important right now in the post-election period that we're about to go into, not to always assume who voted for whom and who's upset about something. I've been really working on that. But in terms of, I was raised by activist parents, and I became an activist. I was at Columbia during the early 70s, and I marched, and I've always been very political and very spiritually oriented at the same time, trying to marry those two parts of myself. But I have noticed since the election that activist part of me is tired. I didn't want to have to do this again. And I'm really questioning what is the wisdom for me at this age? I don't want to I want to respond appropriately, because I think appropriate response is part of wisdom, and not trying to force yourself into a way of being that you think you should. So I'm very much asking those questions about myself right now.
So, some language that you've used and written about is this language of being broken open. Not just being broken, but being broken open. Or that every moment we're broken, that's also a possibility. And I think that's very resonant language for now. So you grew up, was it with atheist intellectual parents, and I grew up with anti-intellectual Southern Baptist parents. So actually we bring some really different. And I think I was one of the few people I knew in my circles of friends who was really not surprised at the. I actually think we're all traumatized. I think this has been a traumatizing election for everybody on every side, whether we know it or not. So
Why weren't you surprised?
because I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma, which was, I think, the very first state that was called for Donald Trump, maybe outside the East Coast. I knew what that campaign was speaking to and what people were hearing. And I also knew that everybody who was hearing parts of that message and just making the decision to vote was not a racist and a misogynist, could not be, however logical it might seem if you lay the facts out in a certain way.
Right.
We're not rational creatures on any side of our political life.
Correct.
And we don't often behave the way we should, whatever that means. And I was aware of the complexity of humanity, and
See, I think that's a definition of wisdom. That I do. I think non-reactive, summing up what's going on now is so important, and not moving into tribal brain of they're bad, we're good. If we do that, we're part of what is the problem.
Yeah, well, yeah, and there's so much fear. There's so much fear that has driven this entire election, and we do not rise to our best. We human creatures do not rise to our best when we're afraid. We fall to our worst. And I agree. And the catastrophizing, the kind of apocalyptic hand-wringing in journalism right now. It's having a bad effect on us. But I still want to return to my question. So,
Okay.
so I think I was going to say,
It's a problem when two
I think maybe-
interviewers speak to each other.
because I had a more nuanced view coming in, but I also experience since the election a real opening. There's all kinds of possibility that wasn't there before, because we are asking questions we weren't asking before. We're asking questions about ourselves, we're asking questions about our neighbors. So again, this language of being broken open, to me, as I was returning to that in your writing, feels just right.
And it's very uncomfortable to feel broken. We don't want to feel broken, and so we don't open. And so broken and shut down is a very dangerous state to be in, because then we form tribes. So it's fear. Broken and shut down
We get
is
literally
fear.
smaller.
Yeah. And it's anti-instinctual. The fight or flight syndrome, the downstairs brain, doesn't know how to be broken and open. It's really a practice. It really is this. It's it's my practice right now. It's my spiritual practice in the post-election time, is to remain open, not just to anti-catastrophizing, but also open to other people. Open to the people, not calling the other enemy. Not calling the other enemy is a practice. And I think it's really important now. That doesn't mean letting people walk all over me, but resisting the urge to make the other enemy.
It's just occurring to me as I'm listening to you talk about that. Another way to think about wisdom is, it is our higher capacity. I mean, all that we're learning about our brains is showing us where we instinctively go, but it's also giving us knowledge that is a tool for working against those instincts, for actually developing new instincts.
Yeah. I think people, myself included, at times, are confused about What's the difference between giving in that way that we're afraid liberals often do, like being the turn the other cheek and not conceding too much ground? What's the difference between, how do we be like Dr. King was now? How do we hold our vision and stay open to the other? Krista?
You quoted Dr. King in one of your TED Talks about, I cannot be my best self if you're not your best self. And then he says something that makes him sound like a physicist. That is the interconnected nature of reality.
Yes.
I'm not dodging your question. I'm just saying what came to mind. Which is something that but I think it's connected. Something I'm uneasy with right now among I'll just say my fellow liberals in this room, although I don't like to define myself that way.
I understand.
I don't like these categories. And, there's still a Southern Baptist from Oklahoma in me. People saying we can't normalize this. And I know where that's coming from, and it's noble. I mean, I get it and I respect it, but it's not wise. It's a way of saying, I'm not going to acknowledge this reality. I'm not going to inhabit this reality.
It's kind of the opposite of mindfulness. If mindfulness is resting in reality as it is, and which is what the Rubin, all of the art is based in unconditional friendliness toward reality. Of course, you also need the Vajra sword of discernment while you're open. But yeah, I feel there are times, like the other day I was catastrophizing and bemoaning, and my husband said, with all due respect, you're having a tantrum.
Right.
And it's true. That's what's saying, I will not my president, I will not accept this, this is not normal. There is a part of that's a tantrum.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many different layers of this, and that, again, just like you said a minute ago, our brains actually don't process that when we're freaked out, and a lot of us are freaked out right now. So in fact, we also have to be a little bit forgiving of ourselves and each other.
Yeah.
But there's the layer at which things are being said and planned and done, where, for example, we might feel called to put our body in front of somebody who is vulnerable and endangered. That's a reality. And I think that will be a calling for some of us. There's also a level at which there's just a huge amount in newspapers that I read that start with the word New York, which I love, of spinning these scenarios of what might happen. And here's the new cabinet secretary, but it's like spending 15 minutes. What did I listen to tonight? This is on NPR. 10 or 15 minutes spent on where the journalist was asking. It had to do with Russia and meddling in the election, and there are examples. It had to do with whether President-elect Trump is reading his intelligence briefings, and somehow it had to do. There was a speculation that went on for 10 minutes about, well, do you think in the coming administration people will be more likely to leak, or something like that? I'm like, why? Is this a good use of our time? We all have crystal balls now, which we don't. We know that doesn't work. Note the polls the day before the election, right? I mean, even our data, it doesn't work for us. Okay, so there's that. So I really think we have to start to separate what is real from what is imagined. And you know what? It's not outside the realm of possibility that the apocalypse is coming. It's not just because of our election, but let's deal with it when we get there. Because the truth is, actually, human beings are actually really good in a true catastrophe. I mean, if we really do have a true catastrophe, we will have all kinds of ways to rise to that that we can't do now. But the third level for me that's important, and this gets at your question about the other. This is another thing we know about our brains, and we know from social psychology. It's so interesting how science has become a companion in spiritual growth and wisdom. We know that when we look at another group, whatever that group is, the other political group, the other racial group, the other ethnic group, we imagine them as a homogeneous block. And we generally, because we tend to present everything culturally in terms of in media and politics, in terms of the most strident voices, we imagine them associated with every quality of the most strident voices who we're familiar with. Whereas we all know, everybody in this room, that in our most intimate circles of family and friends and coworkers, there are a couple of people who we have just about everything in common with. And then there are people who drive us absolutely around the bend. And there are people who we love, who we disagree with on fundamental things. There are people who we stay in relationship with by knowing what we will not talk about. This is intelligence this is intelligence in our private lives that we need to start applying to our public life.
Yeah, I've often thought, like, I'm so good at diversity of race and religion and pride myself on my love and understanding of diversity, but when it comes to diversity of ideas, that's my diversity training. It's not race or sexual orientation. It's like Republicans, That's my diversity training.
So you're not a public radio host, so you can say that.
But my first TED Talk about 5 or 6 years ago, I called it Take the Other to Lunch, because I decided that I really needed to walk my talk about diversity. It wouldn't help me to take someone who was gay or another race to lunch, because I didn't have any problem with it. So I started inviting people to lunch, Tea Party people and people who didn't agree with me. And I actually took to lunch a person who's just been appointed to the cabinet, to Trump's cabinet, Linda McMahon. I took her to lunch in my Take the Other to Lunch.
When was that?
Like 6 years ago or something.
Oh, before she was...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was
Good
when
for
she was...
you. That was...
Yeah. And it was really fascinating. Yeah. So let's get off politics. Let me ask you something. I have a friend in the room who's a very important friend to me, and she started sort of insisting maybe 6, 7 years ago, because I love to quote people all the time, that every time I wanted to quote a man, I had to look for a woman. I just had to find somebody who, because women are so infrequently quoted. We quote Einstein, but we don't quote Marie Curie. And so it's been an amazing practice for me. It's been, and it's extended to not just in who I quote, but who I invite to speak at Omega. I'm wondering, do you, when you think of who you're going to invite on your show, do you think in terms of women and men? And have you found a difference in the quality or the taste or texture of wisdom, men and women?
Oh, that's an interesting... Yeah, we think about this all the time. We think about all kinds of balance. And every once in a while we notice that we've just had a lot of men in a row, and we notice that. And then it happens sometimes that we suddenly have a lot of women in a row, and I'm always happy when we say, we've got to get some men in here. I haven't... I'm not sure I've thought so much... Quality. I mean, I don't. It's not. You're not saying You're saying the kind of
the feminine wisdom.
Yeah. I think that may well be there, and it's just not the way I've analyzed it. Mm-hmm. I just tend to be drawn to people and to lives and voices. Mm-hmm. there is a difference, to be sure. But I mean, raising a son and a daughter, I also see the difference. And like, I also see that my son, if I write something, even now, I've written 3 books. If I write something, I've just written it, I probably wouldn't read it aloud to someone. And if I did, it would be like, is this okay, or what do you think? And my son, he writes something and he reads it and he's so proud of it. He's like, listen to this. And I feel like there's something, there is something biological about that that's just so different. So we get the voices of men presented in a way that we hear them. I think to me, one of the beautiful things about this moment we inhabit, there's so many beautiful things, so many changes, so many ways that we're learning to be more whole. And, the fact that we live in the generation where we're redefining gender, marriage too, that's huge. I mean, and that is also a part of the instability of our moment. I mean, it's just the instability that comes with change, and it's hard on some people more than on others. It's a big deal. I mean, I kind of wish sometimes we could just step back at all these big deals, one after the other.
Yeah, we just did.
Isn't it?
No, I mean,
in a moment where it's not a crisis,
no,
you just
but
say, wow, look at this.
What I mean is that
Yeah.
I do think what happened in the election is a step back. I don't necessarily think it's bad.
I don't mean step back, I just mean stop and take a breath together and say, isn't it remarkable, isn't it huge that we are inhabiting this moment of a seismic shift, like reconsidering what gender is, or reconsidering what marriage is.
I think we are, and I think it's important that those of us who have been very happy about the changes use this as a time to say, wow, this was too fast for a lot of people. We just lived through 10 years of really, 20, 30, of huge cultural changes, enormous cultural changes. And I do think this is a pause. It happened in a traumatic way, but I do think it is a chosen pause by people for whom it was too fast. And I gain some kind of solace in that. It's like consciousness self-corrects. And consciousness, like we both love Teilhard de Chardin, the Catholic mystic, who really believed in his writing that God is evolving, consciousness is evolving.
Yeah.
And I think we were just on a really fast evolutionary track for the past couple of decades, and we're taking a pause.
Yeah, and another way to think about it that also draws us to reflect on ourselves and how we are, is that there's a lot of pain out there, and it turns up showing itself as anger in the context of an election. But I think there's a really big question that, there's work of reweaving common life, or even just figuring out what common life means in the 21st century, and of who we are to each other, and who we are, our neighbors who are strangers. I don't know if you'll feel as this is connected, but when I think about your book that you just wrote, Maro, about your sister, you talk about siblinghood. And, the relationship of siblings, which you really got into. I mean, you went through this incredible experience with your sister with cancer and becoming a donor, and she eventually died, but it was such an amazing experience where you also developed your friendship and love for each other in a new way. But I was actually thinking, as I was, thinking about how you talk about siblinghood and how hard that is. Like, you didn't have a romantic, best friend, sisters relationship, which I didn't have with my sister either.
Did anyone?
But anyway, yeah, I know. I envy those people. But to me, that also seems like a good image for now, because in fact we are related to those, even like the way we talk about the Rust Belt.
Yeah.
What an insulting way to talk about the places people come from.
Well, I think it is so.
Or other parts of our city. So yeah.
Yeah, I like tying that because, basically, when I found out about the science of bone marrow transplant, and I found out that once my bone marrow would be transplanted into my sister, she might reject my cells, and that could kill her, or my cells might attack her body, and that could kill her. It's called rejection or attack. That's the clinical words for it. And that sounded very familiar to me, to our relationship. We'd spent a lot of time rejecting or attacking each other. We actually loved each other very much. We were dear friends, but we did something akin to the Rust Belt, what you just said. We made assumptions about each other and never bothered to really clear them up. And we'd been doing it since we were under 2 years apart. We'd been doing it ever since we were little kids, making assumptions about why you didn't sit next to me on the school bus, or why after I got divorced you wouldn't let me in your house for several years. But instead of talking to each other and saying, what was your reality that caused you to treat me like that? Like, can we interrupt this right now? I don't want to keep telling stories about you. What's going on? That is so hard for us human beings to do. Yeah. Just to say, I feel really disconnected from you and kind of hurt. Can you explain to me what's going on? Instead of saying that in the moment, we'll let like 30 years go by. And so when I found that out about what could happen at the basic cellular stem cell level between my sister and I thought, let's try to clean up our relationship. And we spent a lot of time in therapy together, which was very not out of her wheelhouse completely. She just thought most everything I did was like, she called it woo-woo voodoo. All of my Omega.
That's like her equivalent
work.
of calling it the Rust Belt, right?
Yes. That was
Your
woo-woo
Rust
voodoo
Belt.
was my Rust Belt. And,
Right.
But people do weird things when their life hangs in the balance, and so we went on this. If only all therapy could be as fast as what my sister and I did. We had to. We cleaned it up very fast, and then for the year that she lived, I don't think I've ever been closer to a human being in my life. What the love, you talk about love, you have such a beautiful sentence in your book, like that only love is going to be a big enough aspiration for the 21st century. Mm-hmm. That's such a beautiful line. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's a huge aspiration, love, because love is a very muscular, dangerous, difficult thing to pull off. Anyone who's married knows. And I pulled it off with my sister. Yeah. And we had a life and death situation. But hello, we have one in this country. We have a life and death situation. And if love is the only aspiration big enough now, what does that look like?
Yeah.
Between New Yorkers and Rust Belt people?
Right. Well, I think that's the question we have to really be living. What I know is that love, if we want to call it a public good and claim it as a public good, that we have to be really, it has to be muscular and it has to be practical. It's not about how we feel. It's not romantic. Mm-hmm. It's not something you fall into and fall out of.
Right.
Again, I think we have a lot of intelligence. I mean, right, we know from being married or from having siblings or from having children or parents, that it's unromantic. It's complicated. And I feel like we possess a lot of intelligence, in fact, a lot of wisdom in our individual experience that we don't consider as relevant, but it is to our life together.
Yeah.
And I think we start taking that apart. You know, I had, when I was writing the book, I was writing this chapter on love, and it was just so bad for such a long time. It was just kept being so wrong. And I mean, I kind of knew what I wanted to get at, but I couldn't get at it. And then I think it had some lofty title. And then I called it A Few Things I've Learned About Love. And then I could write it, because that's all I was trying to do.
What are a few of them?
Well, I mean, and I started with this question that was the way big conversations happened at a place that really formed me and in some ways gave rise to my radio project. And you would start with a great theological question, you know, who is God, or what is prayer? And you would have a group of people, and you would have enough time to really do this, and you would start with everybody saying, answer the question through the story of your life. Actually, recently I was having a conversation with somebody and saying that would be the exercise if we could kind of, as a nation, like sit down with people we don't know and say, why did you vote for Donald Trump? Why did you vote for Hillary Clinton? Answer the question through the story of your life.
Yeah.
We would start to get to all the things we need to say, and we would get to our hopes and our fears and our vulnerabilities, as well as our political positions. This moment is not about this election wasn't about politics. It's about the human condition. And that's why wisdom is exactly the topic for this moment. Do we grow this condition up, or do we really give ourselves over to our shadow side? I did want to kind of, you know, one of the qualities of wise lives is not that people are born saintly or that they don't have any problems, right? There are no such things as those, you know, there aren't cartoon character
Wise men and
men, and we find these things out, like that Mother Teresa was depressed, and we're also shocked, right? She was Mother Teresa because she was depressed, right? I mean, it all goes together. But wisdom emerges when people, you know, not in spite of, but through what goes wrong for them as well as what goes right for them, and they have a willingness and a capacity, I would say a determination, to integrate that into their wholeness on the other side. They carry what has gone wrong for them, their wounds. It's part of what makes them whole.
Yeah.
But that's one of those things, that's not natural.
People will often ask me, like, oh, you've been around all these teachers at Omega. I mean, I was 21, 22 when we started Omega 40 years ago. And, you know, so I've met, as you have too, many of these people we put up on pedestals as being so wise and holy and self-loving and loving of others. And I've had the privilege to know so many people, the great authors and teachers. And the privilege for me has been to know how human they are. And no one is on a pedestal for me. Everyone fell off. You know, like and I was pretty young. I was in my 30s when they all started falling off. You know, the relationship expert who's getting divorced, and the monk who slept with the student, and like every single one of them had enormous flaws. And I began to see that if they could teach from that flaw with authenticity instead of pretending that they had it all. I became like allergic to teachers who pretended they had it all together. They just wasn't interesting, boring.
I had the feeling sometimes in this election season that it was like a caricature of some of the worst flaws of the 20th century. And one of them was that in the 20th century, we compartmentalized inner life, right? We glorified big external lives, accomplishment, and you would put what you believed in and what you valued. You would check it at the door when you went to work. You would check it at the door of political life. You would check it at the door of public schools. That was kind of a move we made in part out of good reasons, like a lot of bad things. We thought it was about living in a pluralistic society, and we would take morality out of the public square. But we have a public square where we don't have a vocabulary for moral imagination.
I know. I mean, the way we separated church and state is a beautiful part of American democracy, but we've gone too far. But it's really going to be interesting to see how we go back. You know, in public schools, children are getting no moral education. They can't. And that's too bad. There's no shared spiritual language for children. One of my sons is teaching mindfulness in public schools. That's his
There's
work.
a lot of that now.
Yeah.
I just was at a weekend where I heard about many programs in public schools.
But they're running into a lot of problems, and we knew it would happen because you have to strip any of the Buddhist language, even using a bell or explaining a posture in any way that signifies religious iconography, and it's beginning to be stripped down, so they have to call it things like impulse control as opposed to mindfulness. And
it's also just so lacking in poetry.
it's lacking in poetry. It's true, because morality without poetry is no kid is going to be interested in it. Yeah.
Should we open it up?
Sure.
Yeah, we were permitted to do that.
I knew there was a reason why I was looking forward to this talk so very, very much. Out of all the ones that we've had, thank you both so, so much. So opening it up means really inviting you to share something of your experience, not your whole life story. We don't have time for that. But yes, if you can succinctly pose a question that will stimulate further debate, that's absolutely what we're after. And if you have a hand that you can raise, and we won't think of it as a boundary, we'll think of it as a hand that needs a microphone, we will get a microphone to you. So how about it? Yes. Brave lady there in the fourth row. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. I was just struck me that one of my favorite courses in college was a comparative religion course. And I didn't know anybody else that took it. I chose to take it, and it really planted a seed in me to do a lot of what you're talking about. And what I heard on David Brooks's episode that you did of ennobling the act of disagreement, ennobling argument. And I think that once I took comparative religion and I replaced fear with curiosity and with a love of understanding where other people come from, and that I felt after that course that I didn't see that anywhere else. Until I actually started listening to On Being, which kind of brought me back to that feeling I had in that class. So that's not a question, but I did have a question in your Where lecture, which I listened to, and really...
Oh, at the UU?
Yes,
Yeah.
That was a beautiful lecture. You mentioned our civic duty and the act of listening. And I feel like there's a big connection to that of how we listen, and I wondered if you could give us the step, but maybe a few simple ideas of what that listening and civic duty is, because I feel like that is such a key, whether it's religion or race or, you're sitting in a living room or you're sitting here in the Rubin.
Yeah.
It's about how we listen.
Yeah. I think listening is a basic social art. It's a basic social technology, but it's not just that we've kind of unlearned it, it's that a lot of the things we actively learn actually work against it. So we, for a few generations, have been, trained to be advocates. We have kind of a culture of advocacy. We're trained to represent our identities, our opinions, and we need that. Those are skills we need. We also are trained to essentially resolve conflict by debate and argument. And so real listening is not part of any of these scenarios. And again, I'm not saying we don't need to do those things, but we need a bigger toolkit. And we certainly need a bigger toolkit for this territory we're on now. And listening is, I think the way I learned listening was, growing up, was that kind of in line with what I just described, is like listening is being quiet while the other person says what they have to say. But it's all about waiting your turn to say what you have to say, which is what's really important. And listening is, not primarily about being quiet. It is primarily about being present. And presence has these really basic qualities to it, but that we have to kind of relearn. It's like muscle memory again. It has real curiosity to it. Like you really, really do want to understand.
Right.
And you let go. You make this conscious choice, and you do what it takes in yourself to let go of assumptions. And the intentionality behind, there are better questions and worse questions, but the intentionality behind how you walk into a room matters as much as any word you speak. Like you really have to want to understand. In fact, and here's another quality, another way you can practice it. You have to decide that you're really willing to be surprised. And that's not actually a way we are trained to walk into our public spaces. Like we know what that other person represents. We know what they're about. And if you're willing to be surprised, that means that there's some vulnerability in you. It's not about walking in and ready to be changed. That's not realistic, and that would be shallow. But you are really willing to let some new information in, to let perhaps your idea of this person shift. And when you have a different face to attach to in a whole group of people, that is also going to shift the way you're relating to what those other people have up to now represented for you.
And I think it takes courage. I actually think listening now takes courage. I've been playing around with the idea of the word first responder. We think of it as the fireman and the policeman or the soldier. But I'd like us to become a new kind of first responder, the first one to listen. Because someone has to listen first, because as you say, there's just so much, all you have to do is watch CNN. It's just people yelling at each other. And the first responder who says, I'm going to be the listener, that's scary. That's a sense of vulnerability. Okay, I'll be the vulnerable one here, and I will listen.
Agreed. The people who are threatened, who are vulnerable, whose very being is at stake, they're not the ones we should put forward to be the listeners.
Yes. Yeah.
But there are really simple things you can do, like if somebody, we police language so much. That's another thing. It has its reasons, and it's also it backs us into corners. So somebody uses a word that is a trigger for you, or is it problematic for you, or and there's a lot of those words floating around on both sides. Just to take a breath and genuinely ask, what does that word mean when you use it? What is that word? Put some more words around that for me. Give me a story. It can just break open one of these points where we're kind of trained
Right.
for everything to break down or turn into a drama. We can stop that cycle.
Thank you for a very present conversation.
It's on. It should be on.
Thank
Just
you
speak
for a
into
very present conversation. This might be a gratuitous koan, but I've heard the phrase, an intelligent person seeks to gain knowledge, a wise person seeks to lose it. By the measure of that end game, what would be the difference between an ignorant person and a very wise person?
Do you want to?
Well, it's a beautiful question, and it is a koan, and but I like to say I'm trying to become an I don't know it all, because this know-it-allness, which is really, and it's just the ego of wanting to impress. It's so boring to be with someone who's trying to impress you. Like, we're all so smart. Everyone in this room could be up here. I know you could. I know you have as much wisdom and knowledge and experience as we do. So, sometimes I think, having created Omega, I think I created this monster of like the people up here and the people out there, because it's very false. Like, I could learn so much from everyone in this room. And so to be a know-it-all just robs me of my ability to really connect with other people, which is the true joy in life. The true joy is to connect. Like, I look at you and you're so beautiful, and like, I want to know who you are. Like, I want to know who everybody is. That's what makes me happy and full and alive. So to be humble, curious, open, ready to learn is not the opposite of intelligence. I guess that is a form of wisdom. You can be really, really smart and really not wise.
Can you tell me the koan again? Or tell me what it was again?
It goes, an intelligent person seeks to gain knowledge. A wise person seeks to lose it.
Yeah. I mean, the way I experience that is that that it's not that what you know may grow, but correspondingly, what you know you don't know grows.
Yeah.
That wise people, humble people, carry their questions as reverently as they carry their answers. And something else that came to mind is I once interviewed a geneticist who was also an Anglican priest. And he said he thought there was such a thing as the spirituality of the mystic and the spirituality of the scientist, that these two had a kinship. And that is, at one and the same time, to be bound to discover and know whatever you can, right? To pursue truth as best you can. And to cleave to what you know. And at the same time, to live expectantly and actually with delight at all you do not yet, cannot yet discern and may not discern in this lifetime.
Krista, you earlier in the conversation, you pointed out that children are possessed of great insight. They can just cut through all the stuff because they haven't accreted it with all this baggage and knowledge that's sort of foisted on them. And isn't it true to say that the word guru, which we translate as teacher, actually means remover of shadows? So the idea is that your wisdom is actually inherent. You have it. You just need to slough off the stuff that obscures your inner vision.
Sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Qualify that. I mean, or in the interest of diversity, we've been talking an awful lot about Buddhism tonight, but what about the Sufi tradition, under which you've studied, Elizabeth? What can you bring to the conversation from that tradition that might help this conversation?
Well, Sufism is the mystical dimension of Islam. So a lot of Sufi practices are the same as Islamic practices, and one of the practices of Sufism is the 99 names of Allah, that God has 99 qualities: love, beauty, openness, but also like discernment and strength. And so your teacher will give you different qualities to work on in yourself. And so a child has not developed all those qualities. You know, a child might have native wisdom, but I think to be a wise human, you really do need to grow in all the qualities. So like I have a 7-year-old grandson at the moment, and I would not follow his. Yeah. He needs to grow some.
Yeah, well, we're actually touching on sort of Sufi thought a little bit when we do a program on Rumi next January, because Brad Gooch is bringing out the sort of first popular biography of the poet Rumi, and Zachary Quinto is going to be here to read the poetry for us, so I think that's going to be special. But good, more questions? Who's never asked a question before in public? Okay, keep your hand up. Keep your hand up.
An introvert.
All right, somebody's really keeping their hand up, which is great.
Hi there. I'm so enjoying this conversation. It's really something. So I do work with young girls, like tween and teen girls, and their moms. And it's all about awareness and your relationship with yourself and learning how to quiet and be still and all that good stuff. But I noticed that with all of the social media that's going on out there, it's so incredibly noisy. That's why like an environment like this is so special, because there's this connection, you know. But so my question to you is, do you feel that sort of, you know, transition from human to human connection, and then now it's all this device to device connection, and what impact do you think that is going to have on future generations? And I know I just mentioned mothers and daughters, but I mean in general, from the young generation, you know, to the future, and what impact that's going to have.
I mean, technology and social media, all of that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I've been thinking about that a lot. I think every parent is thinking about that a lot now, and even the difference. My children are 4 years apart, and even the difference between how it had accelerated in those 4 years, and I can't imagine having. My kids are 18 and 23. I can't imagine what it's like to have a 4-year-old now. You know, because I was still at the stage where you could say, no, you can't have a cell phone until you're 14. And I know doesn't work anymore. I feel like this is a guinea pig generation. I mean, we all are in a way. But for kids, you know, who are actually growing up with these phones, kind of like attachments to their fingers, of attachments to their bodies, appendages, I think that they are going to have to work. I mean, I hate to, you know, I think I worry that that we older, or, you know, what is age, but you know, adults often, especially right now, we kind of act like, you know, yeah, we messed up the world and it's up to the kids to fix it. This thing, I don't even know how we can accompany them. It's such a foreign experience, but I think that they are going to be working on life technology balance the way my generation worked on, you know, life-work balance. I wish I had some wisdom. I did actually recently interview Anil Dash. It's not going to be on the air until January, February, but he's a really important guy in Silicon Valley, and he's really a warrior for humanizing technology and also the industry, and saying, you know, here is this most lucrative powerful industry, arguably in human history, and it has grown so quickly, and without any discernment or any, he says in medicine, in other fields, you have codes of conduct. In medicine, you at least have do no harm, and don't be evil, or whatever Google's motto is not the same, right? So there's going to be this kind of catching up to do. And I think after this election, also the role of technology it's the fifth estate, and so then in the middle of that is this question of how people navigate these things in their personal lives. I don't have an answer except to say that the one piece of wisdom I've gotten from great people I've interviewed across the years, technologists, is that we perceive that all of this stuff has landed on us, and it has, and taken over our lives. And we have to remember, and this is like a cognitive move, that it is technology, the internet is in its infancy, we are the grown-ups in the room. And part of our calling as humans is to shape this powerful technology to human purposes. And we do know, people are doing that all over the place too. That story doesn't get told. But collectively, this is our task. And again, I think the election brought that home in a whole new way.
I think it's very exciting. Like, I think, first of all, the horse left the station. I mean, we're not going back. This is our other brain, our phone. It's our other brain. And this will be, as you say, the great challenge of our times. But I think when people bemoan it so much and hate it and think these children don't even relate to each other, and the kids roll their eyes and this is their reality.
Yeah.
This is their reality. So like you introduced me saying amor fati, the Nietzsche's phrase, love of fate. This is humans' fate right now, technology. And I think if we love it, we'll be more creative with how to manage it.
Who else? Yes, someone's got a hand there. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. One thing that came up for me when you were talking about, I don't necessarily want to go back to election stuff, but it's a little connected, and it's so my overarching upset with what happened seemed to come up in my interpersonal relationships, and that is the lack of kindness. And so my question, it wasn't Republican, Democrat, foreign policy, blah, blah, blah. It was just, it was just kindness. Okay. And so my question to you is, do you have any germs of experience, little experiences that you've had where you've experienced just a lack of kindness and your reaction to it not bringing you down to that level? That's my question.
That's a great question. Sort of how to respond to our times, which seem so unkind and no manners and base. Yeah, Krista.
You're serious.
I will.
Okay, you go. I thought you had the ball.
I'll tell you, it's going to sound very simplistic, but like Michelle Obama said, when they go low, I go high. I try being the operative word here, to meet unkindness with kindness. I don't know any other way to deal with it. Anyone who's had a child, you cannot meet their uncivilized behavior with your own, and it just escalates. And so I think it's you used the word muscular. I think we have to make kindness muscular. We have to make it cool to be kind. Because it's cool to be rude and bad. We have to make it like a strong first responder response to be kind. And to show the way. You know, we lionize Dr. King and the other people, and basically they were like satyagraha, kindness, bringing kindness into the public sphere, meeting base behavior with your own compassion. And it's not an idea. If all we do is talk about it or go to yoga class and take warrior pose, or, and then go out and have breakfast with your friends and treat the waitress really awful, that's disgraceful. So I just think it's about being kind.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
It's also true that kindness and all the other kinds of qualities that might go with it are not rewarded
Right.
in our political life. And that's a crisis in my mind, and I don't know how that is going to get resolved, but one implication for me coming out of this year is that we have to take our public life back, and we have to say public life is not restricted to politics, it's not synonymous with politics, it's all of ourselves, it's how we walk through our days, which is just another way to underscore that we have to practice this ourselves, and also take seriously the power of that, right? I mean, the power of the words we use, or an act of kindness, a moment of kindness to make someone's day. That's huge.
Yeah, and to start telling the stories of kind people as heroes. Like, there's this, I often think there's people whose names we should know. And there's this woman after Sandy Hook, and everybody knew the name of the guy who killed the kids. And there was a school in Atlanta where a young man broke in with a machine gun and rounds and rounds of ammunition, and there were 600 children in, and the woman who was the bookkeeper happened to be manning the phones at that moment. Her name was Antoinette Tuff, and I want to know her name. I want everyone to know her name. She went into the room with this young man and the guns, and she said, "Baby, what's the matter? Why are you so upset? Come, talk to me. And he, over 6 or 7 hours of him freaking out and saying he was going to kill her or kill the kids, she just kept talking to him and loving him and telling her, my husband just left me and I have a disabled kid, and they compared notes. And at the end, she got the police on the phone and said he's ready to turn himself in, and he did. And then everybody forgot the story because nothing dramatic happened, and no one knew her. And so that to me is kindness in action, and we have to elevate those stories.
That's a failure of journalism as it's practiced now. It's very sophisticated about corruption and disaster and evil, and not sophisticated about the better angels of our nature. Yeah.
Wow. In the first row, Camila, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Thank you for this conversation. It's refreshing, and it's also, I find myself tearing up, and I'm not sure why, but I think I want to say that it's hard to stay curious, courageous when we feel so frightened. When we feel fear, that basement brain takes over. And for me, I've been trying to stay curious in terms of listening. I come from the Bible Belt. I was born and bred there, so I was not surprised, but nonetheless very disturbed and frightened. So my guiding principle lately has been a quote that I'm probably not going to get accurately, by Maya Angelou, that people will remember not what you said or did, but how you treated them. And I find that as I'm going in the world now, I'm trying to remember that with the waitress, with my friends, with my family, and it's helping me so much, because it's different for me than being kind. It's I want to treat people with a certain intelligence and wisdom, and learnedness. And so that's my solution to being in the world even when I'm afraid. So thank you.
And I know you very well. You're one of my dear friends. And so I want to ask you something. You're an activist. I mean, you are, of most of the people I know, one of the most devoted activists. So how are you holding both of those?
I am finding people who share my conviction to fight racism and injustice. I am finding, because of this time, that more people are willing to come forward than ever before. I'm finding those alliances are more possible now. And so that gives me hope and courage. Yeah.
Thank you. We have time maybe for one last question. Let's take somebody right at the back. Thanks, Vicky.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question for the both of you, if you would. If you were to give yourselves the advice, if you're projecting yourselves as like a 4-year-old girl coming up, what advice would you give to yourself as a 4-year-old woman coming up? Like Einstein had certain questions. What would advice would you have to be wise growing up or to develop wisdom?
I always like to quote one of my favorite feminists, Gerda Lerner, another person whose name we should all know. She said, we have to replace the great men in our heads with ourselves. And that's not just for women. I mean, it's a particularly hard road for women growing up. How you said your son reads what he writes, and then we're all
Isn't
like,
this great what I just wrote?
yeah, is it good? Is it good enough? Do I know? Am I
Right.
worthy? Should I? What do I know? I think I would have told my 4-year-old self, as soon as you can, start replacing the great men in your head with yourself. And all the while that the koan of don't become a know-it-all. It's not about your ego, but know your worth. Know your worth.
Well, I'm thinking of two things. I'm thinking, I don't know about a 4-year-old. I mean, one thing, I spend a lot of time with, people in their 20s, and I love being with people in their 20s, and I love millennials, and my daughter, who's a millennial, says, "You're the only person I know who talks about us in this way." I think millennials get, there's a lot of stereotypes about them. One thing I say is that I was so serious and I was very ambitious, I was very idealistic, and I didn't let myself take enough pleasure. I think, one thing I say in the place I came out in writing a book about wisdom, and the wise people I've interviewed, is they all know how to smile and they know how to laugh at themselves. I believe that a sense of humor is a godly quality. And it is absolutely always there with the wisest people you know. It's a virtue. A sense of humor and an ability to laugh and to smile is a virtue. It's not something that should be optional. It's not for those of us who are saving the world or those of us who are really smart. It's essential. And the other thing that I'm just aware of right now so much, I made that comment a minute ago about journalism. This is really on my mind right now, and I think all of our institutions are in flux. That's another very strange, unnerving thing about right now, right? 10 years ago, you could have said, well, what are schools like? How do you make a school, or how do you construct a workplace, or what is medicine, or what is an economy, or what are politics? We would have had answers for those things. So what is a prison? And now all of the models, they just don't work. They just don't make sense the way we've done them all at once. Journalism is the same. But the problem is that journalism is in the midst of our life, and it is telling us the story of our time, right? It is giving us a narrative that we're all living by. but it's not the whole story. It's not, maybe all the news is fit to print. It's not the whole story. And what I see happening is that that we internalize, what was in the paper today, the headlines, the 5-page expose of the mind of the guy who crashed the plane into the mountain or who killed those people in the school. It's not, that is not the bottom line. It's not, the whole story of what we're up against and who we are as a species.
Yep.
And we all know other stories in the world around us. We know what we're doing. We know what those wise, generative people are doing right around us. But for some reason we don't, this kind of gets at what you just said, we don't take that as seriously as we take what was in the headlines today. And we have to stop that, right? We have to reclaim the narrative of our time and our place in it. And I'm not saying that those terrible things that are happening aren't true, they are. But again, there's a lot more that's happening. And it is also in our lives and in our spheres of action that we create something larger and something richer and something generative and something wise.